Thank you.
Desert Wind, thank you very much. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our very own Curt Condie.
Rob and I are brothers by choice, and we enjoy this philosophy we have together of religious science. Rob tends to be a little more religious, and I tend to lean a little more to the science, and he's a good challenge for me. I love you, Rob. I'm rather fond of the rest of you also. Wendy and I are happy to be here every week as members of the community, and especially today, taking a turn to share. The theme for our talk today is living a life of courage. And for our new guests today, I want to tell you what that means. That is a new thought code, which means we're going to talk about fear today. But we don't like to talk about fear or anything that's scary or slightly negative, so we talk around it and talk about what we want instead. And courage kind of gets confusing because it's a noun, and it's the ability to act in the face of fear, just like that. But we never use it as a noun. It's always used as an adverb to describe what somebody did. So it's kind of an isolated incident, and you don't know if someone has courage until after the fact or not. So I tried to work with this and roll through it. And, you know, it's something that we want. It kind of eludes us. We'll watch movies just to see courage in action so we can learn more about it. We're attracted to it. But to really get there, we got to get our hands dirty. And so I'm going to talk about fear today, out loud, right here in church. Audrey's got the high watch, so you're all in good hands. She will rescue us if it gets too scary in here. And fear is an important thing to look at. I think you'll be amazed as we go through what we learn about it. Hopefully there's something new or a new way of looking at something old. Emerson said that fear defeats most people more than any other one thing in the world. And there are so many different fears to have and so many ways of coping with it that the courage part was confusing, but getting into fear can really be sticky. So just relax and come into this with me. I will start off correctly and say a quote from my dad years ago. Fear knocked at the door, faith answered, and no one was there. And that's the proper way, is to deny and negate fear, and so I started well. I can tell you that fear is an acronym, F-E-A-R, for false evidence appearing real. Franklin Roosevelt said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," and he was right. Then Pearl Harbor was attacked, and we had to add torpedoes to that list. Yeah. You see, there's different kinds of fear. There's the imagined and irrational fear, and then there's the real and rational fear. And it's hard to keep those two separate. Personally, you know, torpedoes are a pretty clear-cut thing, but personally, you get into your own fears, it can get a little tricky. I am afraid of mice. I know. I am also, well, there was a period in my life when I was afraid of vampires. That started back in 1987 and ends in about 2045. Someone had a great book that they thought I should read. I just had to read this, Interview with the Vampire. And I went to college in a small town in central Utah and got to walk home late at night in the dark. And that was, I didn't need to read that book. Later I went on, and a friend told me I had to watch True Blood, which was a series about vampires. And you know what? I didn't need to watch that either. But of course, the fear of mice is an example of an irrational fear. And the fear of vampires is an example of a rational fear. You guys don't know very much about vampires. Fear of mice is irrational. I have never seen a mouse hurt anybody. I've never heard of it. I have seen vampires kill people. That really happens. The point is, the part of our brain that processes fear doesn't know the real from the imaginary. So any fear that I experience is real for me. It's all rational and real while it's happening in my head. Another way we approach fear is people will treat it as a choice. I went out to my uncle's farm one day. I was very young. He took me out to the barn, and there's this big old dog there. And it was about as big as me. And I stepped back and I screamed. And he says, no. And then the dog's going crazy. And he says, stop. Don't you realize he can smell your fear? I said, no. Which, didn't help my situation at all. It's like, if you will stop being fearful, the dog will settle down. Like my fear was agitating the dog and not the other way around. But we get into that cycle where we are, what FDR was talking about, of the fear of fear. And so I'm afraid of the dog, and I'm afraid of being afraid of the dog. And that loops into a cycle. And that is a very anxious, worrisome, uncomfortable place to be. So others of us take another approach, and it's called the ostrich effect. And the myth is that the ostrich, when it was in peril or danger, would bury its head in the sand. Because if it couldn't see the danger, there was no danger. And I understand this thought process of, hey, fear is to keep us from pain and suffering. And the presence of fear is suffering and pain. And so if I ignore the fear, I will just ignore the problem and ignore the pain, and everything's all right. But it's not all right. And then it's not all right to talk about it. If we stay in fear, we increase our fear. If we talk about fear, we're going to increase our fear and create the bad things that are going to happen to us until it creates more and more, gets out of control, and consumes us entirely. So we just keep in that cycle. And what do? It's like, really, if I dwell on it long enough, would the infinite universe really create a vampire just to eat me? I don't know. But people think that, and they listen to this advice, and it's on the internet, so you know it's true. I read this. It says, don't judge your feelings as either good or bad. Using your mindfulness training, recognize your fear thought, release it, refocus your attention on what matters most to you, then repeat, because you'll notice fear is a lifelong companion. Now, I'm the guy who's always taken the juju out of the woo-woo. But if that worked, would you have to repeat it and deal with the fear over and over? Fear is only a problem when we let fear make our decisions for us. Some things we don't need to worry about. I am afraid to jump out of a plane, but I don't want to jump out of a plane, so that's not a problem for me. But I do like to share my ideas and thoughts and what I learn, and so I had to overcome a fear of speaking so that I could share those things with other people. Facing fear, looking at it and understanding it is the only way to take control of our lives and take it away from fear. There is a science to fear. And scientists know more about the emotion of fear than any other. Love is still a mystery. God, they look for in our brain, and they find it everywhere. But fear is very isolated, and we know about it because it comes up so quickly, and it's in certain little spots. And fear is processed in the amygdala part of our brain, or the amygdalae. These are two little almond-sized pieces that sit on the sides of the temporal lobe. If you could draw a line straight in from your eye and straight in from the middle of your ear, that's where the amygdala are, right at the coordinates of those sensory perceptions. And when the sensors come in, it will take a thought and say, does this need to go to fear, or can this go up to the cortex for higher thought, for consideration? Fear is not a choice. Fear is a programmed response. To say that we can choose fear or that we can do something to avoid that is impossible. Fear processes in our brain at a rate 25 times faster than conscious thought. So by the time we realize that fear is coming, we're already there. The good thing about that is, though, is that is measured in milliseconds. So we will go to fear in 1,000 parts of a second, and it takes 300 milliseconds to get us to where we are able to consider things and, choose and decide for ourselves. Scientists, and we know what fear is. It is not being afraid. It is our survival skills and our memory combined with the emotion of anxiety of not knowing exactly what to do in that moment. Scientists have learned how to eliminate fear from us totally and completely. How they came up with this, I don't know. But if you take a piece of metal and stick it in the temporal lobe between the two amygdalae, it knocks them out. They can't communicate with each other, and you have no fear. They did this to mice, and they were not afraid of cats. They were not afraid of falling. They were not afraid of each other. They were not afraid of anything. So we lose the bad part of fear, but we also lose the good part of fear. So they did another experiment. And they brought the subjects in, and they asked them to lie. They said, an interviewer is going to come in. They're going to ask you a list of questions. These are the answers we'd like you to give them. And they were all just outrageous lies. When they told these lies, their amygdalae lit up like crazy. They were going nuts because they were nervous that they were going to get caught, found out, and suffer some punishment for this lie. As they continued through the experiment, that energy and that light went down because nothing happened. And so as nothing happened, the brain starts to say, wait a minute, maybe that's not where we process this. We'll send it up for higher thought. People got comfortable to where it did not light up at all. So that's why liars are so good at what they do, but it's also good news for us because we can condition our minds to deal with fear. Many of us make the mistake of trying to get rid of fear. Instead, our goal should be to free ourselves from the control of fear. The only way to control fear is to look at it. The less we know about something, the more we fear it. The more we know and understand, the less we have to fear. Or to say, the temporal lobe doesn't see it as dangerous and will shift it up for more consideration and evaluation. We did not choose our programming, but we can choose the change and trade in our life of fear for a life of consciousness. I have actually heard people say that discussing fear is not having faith. Looking at fear and analyzing fear is faith in action. Faith does not mean acting as though you are unafraid when you are. It's not fronting. And it's not avoidance and sticking your head in the sand. The Bible says faith is the knowledge of things hoped for. It can be painful, but it's a small pain. And the purpose of fear is to let us know that we are in a situation that needs to change quickly. And so if we can sit in the discomfort of fear, just for a moment, we can save ourselves the pain of what the fear is trying to teach us and tell us. Usually the opposite of what we fear is our greatest and deepest desires. So by looking at that, we condition our brain not to be afraid of what's not going to happen, and it frees us up for what we want to see happen in our life. I have come to learn and understand that leaning into our emotions is the only way to move through them, as opposed to trying to numb them or ignore them. When we can lean into our feelings with curiosity, we can learn the gifts they have to teach us. They are guides to all our longings and desires and to living the full and satisfying life that we have imagined. This is in perfect alignment with our spiritual philosophy. When we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. When we change ourselves, we look at things differently. Unless we're looking at torpedoes. Those are still bad. We will never know anything about fear unless we take a look at it. We're only born with two fears: the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. Everything else we learn by experience. We're either taught that by our parents, or we come by it honestly, where we went into a situation with good positive feelings and we were hurt because we were unaware of what was going on. So the way to support somebody in fear is not to say, stop, you're sitting in fear, choose something else. The way to say it is, what are you afraid of? What can I help you with? Because they won't be able to see the rational from the irrational, and they need help from a trusted person. We learn from those we trust about fear, and we can unlearn fear talking to those we trust. Better words to use about looking at fear and the benefits of it, which might make us feel more comfortable, is increasing our awareness of life, refining our intention, honing our focus. My advice is, do not move ahead despite fear, but move ahead in the knowledge of fear and the best choice. I worked for a while with a man named Bud, and I'm pretty sure Bud wasn't his name, but everybody called him that, and his little name badge said Bud. And Bud did two things in life, and he was a baker his whole life, except for the time during World War II when he was in the Navy. He was in the Navy, and he was on a small boat, a gunboat. And there's only two kinds of vessels in the Navy, ships and boats, and this was a boat, and boats are very small. And Bud had excellent eyesight and was very smart. So he had the honor of standing up on the highest part of the boat where he could see incoming planes. They had the guns and the torpedoes, and it was just him out there with some binoculars. And he could figure out in that time where guns should be pointed and directed and shout those orders down or radio them down so that they could defend the boat. And I asked him, he showed me one day, he pasted off how big this boat was. And I was amazed. I was very young, and I said, how do you do that and process that information in the midst of all that fear? And he says, there's no fear. You can't do that while you're processing all this information. He says, you've got one job to do, and you do that job, and you focus on what you need to do. We tend to think of people with courage as operating in the face of fear and not the absence of fear. In reality, what they're doing is they have looked at their fear, they have analyzed it, they've increased their understanding of that fearful situation, and they are desensitized to the effect of fear. The risks are still there, the danger is still there, but they proceed with a clear mind to what their job is and what their goal is. They don't act in spite of fear because they are not experiencing fear. The risks and dangers are still present, but the emotion is not. They see the situation from higher understanding. They see it differently. They act differently. Heroes are called out for their bravery and courage, and most always they'll shrug their shoulders and say, I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done. Conquering fear is liberating and empowering. Through the process of taking a deep look at ourselves, our fear, and our pain, we nurture our hearts and find strength for times of action. The word courage comes from the Latin root cor, which literally means to tell who you are with your whole heart. Today, we call that courage. We call that confidence. We call that confidence. This confidence is empowering and allows you to face situations that were previously processed into fear. Now, having control of your conscious thought, you'll find yourself standing in your own power, asking for what you want, being kind and generous, forgiving yourself, trusting yourself, and loving yourself. And people will look at you and say, now that's real courage. Thank you.
Sitting rooted in your chair, your feet square on the floor. Find that space within to know gratitude for Curt and his important message about courage in the face of fear, and our musicians and their beautiful music, and our special music also. All of these things happened right here for us to carry in our hearts their message, the feeling of wholeness, love, and peace in the face of scary things that might come up during the week. This is an important week to prepare for a holy time in our culture, but it should be every day. Feeling the love of the Christ consciousness, being grateful for it, and putting it into action each and every moment for ourselves, our family, our community, and the world.